Andy Johnson, Minnesota State University, reading specialist. Today's topic is wrestling with reading instruction, based on the premise that a good wrestling practice room is very much like a reading classroom, a good reading classroom, what we see in that good reading classroom. There I am once upon a time before I was kindly old Dr. Johnson with no hair. I was Coach Johnson with lots of hair. This is sometime back in 1986 or 87, River Falls High School in River Falls, Wisconsin. Now, a good wrestling room, this is what we would see. We expect our wrestlers to be at different levels. We don't expect them all to be performing at the same levels. We don't ability group them. We expect them to be at different places, and that's good, because wrestlers are not standardized products. As well, because they're not standardized products, they use different skills. They adopt and adapt based on their body type, what skills they use best, what takedowns or pinning moves work best for them. As well, a heavyweight looks much different than a 98-pounder, so different skills are taught and used. We set different goals for each. For some, it may simply be being on the team. For others, it might be wrestling one match. For others, it's a better than 500 record. For others, it's conference championship, and so on and so on. We do not expect them all to achieve the same. We set different goals for each wrestler. Skills instruction is short. We didn't spend more than 5 minutes teaching a skill, and then we'd get them using that skill. We didn't expect mastery of a skill in a single session. I'd introduce the single leg takedown. First night of practice, we would review it throughout the season. We don't expect mastery. For some skills, we practice for automaticity. I didn't want them thinking about the steps when they're out there wrestling. Let's see, step 1, put my foot here. Step 2 there. No, we needed short-term memory to be freed up to concentrate on wrestling. What skills did I teach? Well, the wrestlers were my scope and sequence chart. I watched my wrestlers in authentic wrestling situations, both in the classroom or the practice room and in authentic wrestling matches. Based on what we saw and didn't see, we would teach those skills based on their performance in authentic wrestling situations. Guided practice was used to practice a new skill. I'd break it down into steps, I'd demonstrate, then I'd walk students or wrestlers through each step of the skill. And then they'd practice it by themselves. This is called direct instruction. The zone of proximal development was used to teach skills. We didn't get too far above them. We didn't teach them complicated wrestling skills if they weren't ready for it. And the zone of proximal development was used for conditioning. By the way, the zone of proximal development is the level above the independent level, but below the frustration level, where someone can perform a task with the teacher's help. That's just above their independent level. So for teaching, we tried to find skills that were just a little above where most of our wrestlers were at. For conditioning, we didn't grind them into the ground. We tried to get just a little ahead of where they're at. Most of wrestling practice was spent wrestling. And in wrestling practice, we expect mistakes. We encourage mistakes. This was the learning place. Learning stations were used. We'd set up 5 to 6 stations around the room. We'd have assistant coaches, older wrestlers, maybe a parent come in, and at each station, wrestlers worked on a specific skill. On the whistle, they'd move around until all the stations were covered. Very effective. And then conversation and social interaction were used. Yes, in the learning stations, there was good conversation. What's working, what's not working, how do you do this? In practice, wrestlers were put in groups of 3 or 4. to practice takedowns or moves or escapes. And the conversation that took place was an important part of learning. Assessment. Wrestlers were assessed not by how they performed in the wrestling practice room, how they performed some wrestling sub-skill, but how they performed in authentic wrestling situations. As well, I was assessed by how my wrestlers performed, not in the practice room, not on a test of wrestling skills, but how they performed in wrestling matches. And the emotional element. I'd forgotten about that when I first started coaching. An important part. We recognized that wrestlers needed support. Wrestlers were different. Some had different motivations. And we ended every practice with a game addressing that emotional element. We wanted them to attach something positive to wrestling practice, because wrestling practice can be a drag. It can be hard to endure over the course of a season. In my 2 years as head coach, 22-4 record, I was okay as a coach, but eventually I became Dr. Johnson, and I started looking at reading workshop and using this and teaching it. And reading workshop, when done well, is like a good reading practice room. We expect our readers to be at different levels. We don't expect everyone to be above average, although we'd like that. But if everyone was above average, eventually above average would be average, and on and on and on. But we expect there to be different levels and different abilities. In a reading workshop, we don't have to ability group. Students can find books at their level. And we have flexible groupings. We recognize that our readers are not standardized products. Based on how their brain functions, they use different skills to comprehend or to recognize words. So we don't teach in a standardized way. One size of instruction does not fit all. We need teachers with toolboxes filled with teaching tools with different pedagogical strategies so that they can use them. We set different goals for our readers. For some, it may be reading 4 books in a month, doing 1 book talk. For others, it's 4 books in a week, doing 6 journal entries. But we set different goals for each. And by setting different goals for each, all students can be successful at achieving their goals. We don't have winners and losers. Skills instruction is short, briskly paced. In a 60-minute class, we would expect at least 40 minutes be spent in authentic reading situations. Ideally, it would be 45 or 50. Skills instruction is short, and then we get them using the skill as short as possible. You don't learn to read by skills instruction. You need a little of that, but then you need to practice using the skill in authentic reading situations. And we don't expect mastery in a single session. Yes, I'll introduce the short A sound or a comprehension skill. But I don't expect mastery, so we hit it, we review, reinforce in different ways throughout the year. That's how you achieve mastery over time, by being exposed and using skills in different contexts. We practice for automaticity. Yes, some skills you need to be automatic. You need to free up short-term memory so you're not thinking about it. Comprehension skills are such. Sight words are such. Some skills we practice, but that practice is short. 5 minutes. Maybe 8 minutes, but you don't come to reading class to practice skills. You come to reading class to practice reading. We should call it reading practice, not reading class. We look at our students. We hear them read. We listen to them read in authentic reading situations, and based on what we're observing, what we're seeing, what they are telling us, we use that to inform our instruction. They are our scope and sequence chart, not some list that someone has predetermined. Readers aren't standardized products. Guided practice is used to teach a new skill. When we introduce a new skill, we use guided practice. We provide scaffolding and support so they can practice using that skill so they're not feeling frustration. And then we use independent practice, get them using the skill by reading, authentic reading situations. The zone of proximal development, this is the place above one's independent level and below the frustration level where you can perform a skill with some scaffolding or teacher help or coach help. When introducing a new skill, we try to get just above where we think students are at and provide some support, some scaffolding, so they can practice using that skill. When introducing a story that may be a little above their reading level, we use pre-reading activities to provide a scaffold so all students can read successfully. And as far as reading endurance, we recognize that students may be able to read only for 10 minutes at the beginning of the year, but we slowly build up until they're able to read 30, 40, and 50 minutes. And most of reading practice is spent in authentic reading. Reading good books, 60 minutes. You should focus on getting maybe 40 to 50 minutes in actual reading practice, where they're reading good books, maybe talking about good books, maybe writing journal entries about good books, but engaged in authentic literacy activities. Learning stations are used sometimes, not all the time, but once in a while to practice skills, different stations around the room. You move around the stations and the social interaction that takes place there is good. As well, conversation and social interactions are created and designed by the teacher around good books. Students are talking about good books, they're writing about good books, they're offering book critiques and evaluations, and they're talking. Conversation, social interaction, good. Assessment. My readers are assessed, not on some silly standardized test. That's a snapshot of reading sub-skills apart from an authentic reading situation, but how they perform reading actual books. Are they enjoying their books? Are they reading lots of books? Are they able to create meaning with the books that they read? That's the whole purpose of reading instruction, to develop students' abilities to create meaning with text. That's why we teach reading, not so they can perform on some silly standardized test that measures reading sub-skills in inauthentic reading situations. As well, teachers are assessed or should be assessed by how their readers read. And finally, we recognize the emotional element. We think and we emote with the same brain. It's silly to think that one would not impact the other. So if a student is a struggling reader, we say not a big deal. A lot of kids struggle with reading. We're going to do what we can to help you. And we ended practice, reading practice, with a game of some sort, just so they don't attach reading with something aversive, but they can attach some positive emotion with that reading class, even if they're a struggling reader. All right, reading practice, a good wrestling room, they are very, very similar.